They made me sign a prenup to protect their precious son's money. 10 years later, sitting in that cold conference room, watching my mother-in-law slide those papers across the mahogany table with that smug smile, she had no idea that the signature they forced me to write was about to cost them everything they thought they were protecting, because the gold digger they married off had been secretly funding their lifestyle the entire time. Have you ever been underestimated by the people who should love you most? And when I stood up to leave that meeting, the prenup in my hand wasn't what they thought it was. Sunday dinners at the Martinez household were supposed to be sacred. Every week for 10 years, I'd sit at that pristine dining table, listening to my mother-in-law, Patricia, lecture about proper etiquette, while my father-in-law, Robert, discussed his latest business ventures. My husband, David, would nod along, occasionally throwing me those apologetic glances that said, "Just bear with them." I'd learned to perfect the art of the grateful smile, the appreciative nod, the humble daughter-in-law who knew her place. "Emily, dear," Patricia would say, cutting her roast with surgical precision, "you're so lucky David chose you. Not many men would take such a risk." The pause before risk always hung in the air like expensive perfume, cloying and impossible to ignore. I'd squeeze David's hand under the table, feeling his wedding ring press against my fingers, and remind myself that love was supposed to conquer all. The house itself was a monument to old money, or at least what they wanted people to think was old money. Crystal chandeliers, imported marble, family portraits in gilded frames, everything designed to intimidate, to remind you of your place in their hierarchy. I'd spent a decade walking through those halls, my footsteps muffled by Persian rugs that cost more than most people's cars. But what I signed that day wasn't what anyone thought. That moment 10 years ago, my hands shaking as I put pen to paper, everyone watching me like I was signing away my soul. None of them knew what they were really witnessing. Have you ever had to smile while someone insulted everything you are? That was my life every Sunday for 10 years. The cracks started showing during David's birthday dinner last spring. Patricia was regaling us with stories about their family's legacy when she casually mentioned how fortunate I was to have married into established wealth. She gestured around the dining room with proprietary pride, her diamond bracelet catching the light from the chandelier. "Of course, we had to protect our assets," she continued, cutting her eyes toward me. "The prenup was essential. Young girls these days, you never know their true intentions." She said it like I wasn't sitting right there, like I was a piece of furniture that had somehow gained the ability to hear. David shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, please." "Oh, it's fine, darling. Emily understands. She's proven herself to be quite manageable over the years." That word, manageable, hit like a slap. Not loving, not cherished, not even tolerated. Manageable. You know that feeling when people talk about you like you're not there? When they reduce your entire existence to a threat level that needs to be contained? I felt my face burn, but I kept my expression neutral. Years of practice had taught me that reacting only gave them ammunition. That's when I noticed something strange about their family wealth. Patricia's designer dress still had the tags tucked under the collar. Robert's watch, the one he claimed was a family heirloom, had a price sticker on the back that I could see when he reached for his wine glass. The antique vase on the sideboard had a home goods clearance tag peeling off the bottom. What would you do if your family treated you like a charity case while living a lie themselves? The evidence started mounting after that dinner. I began paying attention, really paying attention, to things I'd overlooked for a decade. The designer handbags Patricia carried were always last season's styles, the kind you could find at outlet malls. Robert's business cards were printed on cheap paper, not the heavy cardstock you'd expect from a successful entrepreneur. Their housekeeper, Maria, only came once a month now instead of weekly like she had when I first married David. Most telling of all were the bills. David had started getting anxious whenever mail arrived, shuffling through envelopes with a frown that deepened with each invoice. When I offered to help with household finances, he'd wave me off with a tight smile. "Family business," he'd say. "Nothing for you to worry about." But I was worrying. Not about money. God knows I had more than enough of my own. But about the growing realization that something was fundamentally wrong with the picture I'd been living in. The family that had spent 10 years treating me like I was after their money was hemorrhaging cash faster than they could hide it. I started noticing David's nervous behavior around money topics. When the waiter at our anniversary dinner mentioned the wine's price, David's face went white. When our neighbor mentioned refinancing their house, David quickly changed the subject. When his mother asked him to pick up the dinner check this once, he fumbled for his wallet with shaking hands. The family that called me a gold digger was barely staying afloat, and somehow, without realizing it, I'd been watching them drown in their own pride for years. But they were about to cross a line I couldn't ignore. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning. Patricia's voice was crisp, businesslike. "Emily, dear, we need to have a family meeting. This Saturday, 2 o'clock. Don't be late." No please, no explanation, no question about my availability. Just a summons, like I was an employee being called to account for something. When I asked David about it, he couldn't meet my eyes. "It's probably nothing," he said, but his voice cracked on nothing, like he was 17 again. "Would you have kept quiet this long?" I kept asking myself that question as Saturday approached. 10 years of subtle insults, 10 years of being treated like hired help with a marriage license, 10 years of watching them play house with money they didn't have while calling me the parasite. Saturday arrived gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly. I dressed carefully. Not too nice, wouldn't want to look like I was showing off, but not too casual either. They'd find fault either way, but I'd learned to minimize their ammunition over the years. The black dress was simple, elegant, the kind of thing that couldn't be criticized for being too flashy or too cheap. Walking up their front steps felt different this time. Maybe it was knowing that this charade was finally coming to an end, or maybe it was the weight of secrets I'd been carrying for so long. The door opened before I could ring the bell. Patricia, dressed in what I now recognized as a knockoff Chanel suit, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Emily, punctual as always, how refreshing." She air-kissed both my cheeks, her perfume overwhelming and probably fake too. "The family is waiting in the study." I wanted to be loved for me, not my money. That's why I'd hidden who I really was for so long. Growing up with a trust fund meant growing up never knowing if people liked Emily or liked Emily's bank account. When I met David in college, I was just another student working part-time at the campus coffee shop. He had no idea that my modest apartment was something I'd chosen, not something I was stuck with. Our courtship was beautifully normal. He paid for dinners with carefully saved money from his internship. I let him, enjoying the novelty of being taken care of instead of being the one everyone expected to pick up the check. When he proudly showed me his family home for the first time, I oohed and awed appropriately, never mentioning that my childhood bedroom was bigger than their entire first floor. Looking at myself in wedding photos now, I could see the hope in my eyes. I really believed that love would be enough, that if I just proved myself worthy, his family would eventually accept me. The prenup signing was my first real test. Would I put my money where my mouth was? The irony wasn't lost on me even then. Then came the family meeting that changed everything. Walking into Robert's study felt like entering a courtroom where I was the defendant and they were judge, jury, and executioner all rolled into one. David sat behind his father's desk. Patricia flanked him like a general preparing for battle, and Robert stood by the window with his arms crossed, his face grim. "Sit down, Emily," Patricia said, gesturing to the chair across from the desk. The chair was lower than theirs, positioned so I'd have to look up at them. Theater of intimidation, perfectly choreographed. The gold digger they thought they married was about to show them what real money looked like. But first, I had to sit through their performance. What do you think they wanted to discuss? I had a pretty good idea, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. I took my seat in that deliberately positioned chair, folding my hands in my lap like the obedient daughter-in-law they expected me to be. Patricia opened a leather portfolio with theatrical precision, her manicured nails clicking against the mahogany surface as she arranged papers like a lawyer preparing for closing arguments. "Emily," she began, her voice carrying that familiar tone of disappointed authority. "We've been very patient with you over the years, very generous despite our initial reservations about David's choice." Robert cleared his throat from his position by the window. "What Patricia means is that we've invested considerable resources in this family, and frankly, the return on that investment has been disappointing." I felt my eyebrows raise involuntarily. Investment? Return? They were talking about me like I was a stock portfolio that had underperformed, but I kept my voice level, my expression curious rather than defensive. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean." David shifted uncomfortably behind the desk, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him rather than on me. That should have been my first warning sign, but I was still operating under the assumption that my husband was on my side. Can you guess what they accused me of this time? The creativity of their complaints never ceased to amaze me. "The lifestyle you've become accustomed to," Patricia continued, sliding a sheet of paper toward me, "comes with certain expectations, contributions to the family welfare that, quite frankly, have been lacking." I leaned forward to examine the paper. It was an itemized list, typed on expensive letterhead, detailing every dollar they claimed to have spent on me over the past 10 years. Dinners, gifts, vacation expenses, even the cost of my wedding dress, which I remembered distinctly I had offered to pay for myself before Patricia insisted it was tradition for the groom's family to cover it. The total at the bottom made me blink. $247,000. "We've been more than generous," Robert added, his voice carrying the weight of a man who believed he held all the cards. "But generosity isn't charity, Emily, and we're not running a charity here. Have you ever wanted to record a moment of pure karma? Because that's when I pulled out my phone. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice carefully neutral, "but I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You're asking me to pay you back for expenses you chose to incur over the past 10 years? Patricia's smile was razor sharp. "We're not asking, dear. We're telling you. The prenup was very clear about financial responsibilities, and you've been in breach of those responsibilities for quite some time." That's when I realized they hadn't just called this meeting to humiliate me. They'd called it to essentially extort me. In their minds, I was the broke gold digger who had been living off their generosity, and now it was time to pay the piper. They'd probably been planning this for months, waiting for the right moment to corner me. David finally looked up from the papers, his expression a mixture of guilt and resignation. "Emily, I know this seems harsh, but what, David?" I interrupted, my voice still calm but with a steel edge creeping in. "But you all sat around planning how to shake down your son's wife, but you decided that 10 years of treating me like hired help wasn't enough, so now you want me to pay for the privilege?" "Don't be dramatic," Patricia snapped, her composed facade slipping for just a moment. "You've lived in our world for a decade without contributing anything meaningful to it. Consider this: back payment for services rendered. Services rendered. Like I was some kind of escort they'd been employing. That's when I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. The screen illuminated with numbers that would have made their itemized list look like pocket change. But instead of showing them immediately, I scrolled to a different section, my transaction history. "You know," I said conversationally, "it's funny that you mention contributions to family welfare, because I've been very interested in that topic myself." What do you think shocked them more? The numbers on my phone screen, or the fact that I wasn't cowering under their attack? I turned my phone around so they could see the screen clearly. The first transaction was from just 2 months ago, a $15,000 transfer to David's personal account. Below that, another $12,000 from March, then $8,000 in February. The list went on and on, stretching back years. "David," I said quietly, "would you like to explain to your parents where this money came from?" The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. "Emily, please. Please what?" I stood up, suddenly feeling like the chair had been a cage I'd finally broken out of. "Please continue to let them think I'm some penniless gold digger while I've been quietly funding their son's lifestyle for years?" Patricia snatched the phone from my hands, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the endless list of transfers. $127,000, she breathed, her voice barely audible. "David, what is this?" Robert moved away from the window, his commanding presence evaporating as he saw the numbers. "I don't understand. Where did this money come from?" That's when I dropped the first bomb. "My trust fund," I said simply, "the one my grandfather established when I was born, the one that's been generating more money every year than this entire family spends." But that wasn't even my biggest secret. The real revelation was still coming. The silence in the room was deafening. Patricia had gone completely white, still staring at my phone like it was showing her lottery numbers. Robert had sunk into the chair by the window, his confident businessman facade crumbling in real time. And David looked like he wanted to disappear into the mahogany desk. "How much?" Patricia whispered. I smiled. Not the grateful, submissive smile I'd perfected over the years, but something entirely new, something that felt like me for the first time in a decade. The trust fund? It's worth about $2.8 million currently, but that's not including my investment portfolio, which is managed separately. Have you ever laughed or cried in that moment when the tables completely turn? I wanted to do both. "Investment portfolio," Robert repeated dumbly. "About $1.2 million in blue-chip stocks, another $800,000 in tech companies, and $400,000 in real estate investments." I recited the numbers like I was reading a grocery list, watching their faces cycle through disbelief, horror, and something that might have been respect if it weren't so tainted with greed. "But the prenup," Patricia started, "protects your son's assets from me," I finished. Which, as it turns out, is hilarious since he doesn't actually have any assets to protect. The house has a second mortgage, doesn't it, David? And the business isn't doing nearly as well as you all pretend. Their faces when they saw the numbers. You've been watching them insult a millionaire for 10 years, and the absurdity of it was finally hitting home. David found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a squeak. "Emily, I can explain." "Can you?" I turned to face him fully, this man I'd loved for over a decade, this man who'd let his family treat me like garbage while secretly taking my money to maintain his lifestyle. "Can you explain why you've been depositing my checks while letting your mother call me a parasite? Can you explain why you've been funding family dinners with my money while sitting there nodding when your father lectures me about financial responsibility?" Would you have laughed or cried in that moment? I was honestly torn between the two. But here's the thing that really broke my heart. My husband's betrayal was just the beginning. Because as I stood there, watching my husband squirm and his parents recalculate everything they thought they knew about me, I realized something devastating. You know that moment when everything clicks into place? When all the little inconsistencies and strange behaviors suddenly form a clear picture. That's what was happening to me, and the picture wasn't pretty. David had known about my money all along. He'd known from the very beginning, probably before we were even married. The coffee shop job, the modest apartment, the careful budgeting. He'd seen through all of it, or someone had told him the truth. And instead of loving me for who I was, he'd seen an opportunity. "You knew," I said, the words coming out flat and certain. "From the beginning, you knew who I really was." He couldn't meet my eyes. "Emily, it wasn't like that." "Wasn't like what? Wasn't like you married me for my money while letting your family think I married you for yours? Wasn't like you've been playing the struggling young husband while living off your wife's trust fund? For the first time in years, I was seeing my real reflection, not the grateful daughter-in-law they'd trained me to be, but the woman I'd been before. I let them diminish me. And she was furious. But my husband's betrayal was just the beginning, because as the pieces fell into place, I realized the scope of what had been done to me was so much bigger than I'd imagined. What would your next move be? Because mine was about to surprise everyone in that room, including myself. The family that called me a parasite had been the real parasites all along, and they were about to discover just how expensive their decade-long con had been. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had been 10 years in the making. I could practically hear their minds racing, recalculating every interaction, every assumption, every cruel comment they'd made about the gold digger who had apparently been bankrolling their lifestyle without them even knowing it. Patricia was the first to recover, her lawyer instincts kicking in even as her world crumbled around her. "This changes nothing," she said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "The prenup still stands. You signed it willingly." That's when I pulled out the real prenup, the one they'd never seen, the one my family's legal team had prepared after their lawyer had shown his hand. Did you see this coming? Because I'd been 10 steps ahead of them from the moment they'd handed me those papers a decade ago. "You're absolutely right," I said, reaching into my purse and extracting a manila envelope. "I did sign a prenup willingly. But what you don't know is that my trust fund came with its own legal team, and they've been very interested in this marriage from day one. My grandfather hadn't just left me money, he'd left me protection. The old man had seen enough fortune hunters in his day to know that wealth could make you a target. So every major life decision I made came with a team of lawyers whose job was to make sure I wasn't being taken advantage of. When David proposed," I continued, opening the envelope, "my family's attorneys insisted on reviewing any legal documents I'd be asked to sign. They found your prenup very interesting." David's face had gone from white to green. "Emily, please don't what? Don't tell them about the fraud investigation?" I pulled out a thick stack of papers, official letterheads visible even from across the room. "Don't mention that invalidating a prenup based on fraudulent representation is actually quite straightforward when you have documentation. Did you think I'd really be that naive for 10 years? Every contribution I'd made had been documented, every conversation recorded, every instance of their deception carefully cataloged by investigators who specialized in exactly this kind of family financial abuse. The beautiful thing about having money," I said, watching Patricia's face cycle through denial, anger, and dawning horror, "is that you can afford the best legal advice. And my lawyers have been documenting everything since the day we got married." Robert finally found his voice. "You can't prove anything. David never coerced you into giving him money." I laughed. Actually laughed. For the first time in that house in probably 5 years. "You're right. He didn't coerce me. He just lied about his family's financial situation, allowed me to be emotionally abused for a decade, and accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars while knowing his family was calling me a gold digger. That's not coercion. That's fraud." Sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous, and I'd been quiet for far too long. My trust fund came with a team that included forensic accountants, private investigators, and attorneys who specialized in exactly this kind of sophisticated theft. They'd been watching this marriage like a documentary crew, collecting evidence of systematic financial and emotional abuse. "Every contribution I made was documented," I continued, spreading the papers across Robert's desk like I was dealing cards. "Every cruel comment. Every family dinner where I was treated like hired help. Every time David took my money while sitting silently as you all called me a parasite. It's all here." The investigation had revealed the scope of their deception. David's business was failing, had been failing for years. The family home had been refinanced 3 times. Patricia's law practice was hemorrhaging clients. They'd been living a complete lie, propped up by my money and their collective delusion of superiority. When the FBI showed up at their door, I paused, watching their faces. Oh, that hasn't happened yet. But financial fraud, especially involving marriage, is a federal crime. And when it crosses state lines, which it did, since my trust is managed in Delaware, it becomes very interesting to very serious people. Have you ever seen karma work this fast? Because what happened next was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it and smiled. Actually, that was my attorney. The paperwork has been filed. Bank accounts will be frozen within the hour pending investigation, and criminal charges are being filed this afternoon. Patricia stood so quickly, her chair toppled backward. You can't do this. This is our family. No, I said, standing to face her. This is my family. Or was. I've spent 10 years trying to earn a place in it, and all I earned was the right to be robbed by people who should have loved me. But here's what I hadn't told them yet. The real reason I'd been able to disappear so completely into their narrative about who I was. My family wasn't just wealthy. We were connected. Old money, old power, old networks that could make life very difficult for people who crossed us. Ever wonder what happens when you mess with the wrong person? They were about to find out. My family doesn't take kindly to fraud, I said, and for the first time, I let them hear the steel that had always been there, hidden under years of trying to be small enough for their comfort. My grandfather built his fortune in steel and coal, but my father diversified into technology and defense contracting. Do you have any idea how many federal judges owe their careers to Martinez family political contributions? David looked like he might be sick. Emily, you don't understand. My family, they're not bad people. They're just what? Just criminals? Just people who decided that psychologically torturing someone for a decade was acceptable as long as they got paid for it? I was surprised by the coldness in my own voice. You're right, David. I don't understand. I don't understand how the man I loved could sit there week after week, watching his family destroy me piece by piece while depositing my checks. I got my justice, but looking around that room, at Patricia's tears, at Robert's defeated posture, at David's broken expression, I felt something hollowing out inside my chest. Was this really what victory was supposed to feel like? The real question was, what kind of person had I become? Had I turned into exactly the kind of cold, calculating person they'd always accused me of being? But the wheels were already in motion. My phone buzzed again, this time with confirmation that the FBI's Economic Crimes Unit had opened an official investigation. Asset forfeiture proceedings would begin Monday. David would likely face federal charges for wire fraud and conspiracy. Was I becoming just like them? I asked the room, though I wasn't really expecting an answer. Is this who you all wanted me to be? The house that had intimidated me for so long suddenly felt like a movie set. All facade, no substance. The crystal chandeliers were probably leased. The Persian rugs were definitely knockoffs. Even the family portraits looked fake in this new light, like they'd been purchased at an estate sale to create the illusion of legacy. My nephew's college fund. That thought hit me like a physical blow. David's sister's son, barely 16, who'd never done anything to me except exist in this toxic family system. The lawsuit I'd filed would freeze all family assets, including the education fund they'd set up for him. Success felt like ice in my veins, and I was starting to understand why some victories felt more like defeats. Have you ever won something that cost you everything? Because as I stood there, watching the family I'd tried to love for 10 years crumble under the weight of their own deceptions, I realized that my victory was hollow. I'd gotten justice, but I'd lost my capacity for mercy in the process. The person looking back at me from the antique mirror above Robert's desk wasn't someone I recognized. 10 years of trying to be small had been replaced by something harder, colder, more calculating than I'd ever intended to become. When does justice become cruelty? But it was too late to stop what I'd set in motion. The legal machinery was grinding forward with its own momentum, and everyone in this family, guilty and innocent alike, was going to be crushed under its wheels. That's when my phone rang with the call that changed everything. I glanced at the screen, and my blood turned to ice water. Mom flashed on the display, and suddenly I knew that my crusade for justice was about to reveal something I wasn't prepared to face. Are we all just repeating cycles of hurt? Because the voice on the other end of that call was about to show me exactly where I'd learned to weaponize money and power against the people who were supposed to love me. Emily, darling. My mother's voice was crisp, professional, satisfied. I just wanted to congratulate you on finally handling the Martinez situation properly. Your father and I were beginning to wonder if you'd ever develop a proper backbone. The blood drained from my face as the pieces clicked into place. Mom, what are you talking about? Oh, sweetheart, did you think we hadn't been monitoring this whole charade? A Martinez marrying into a failing family? Please. We've had investigators watching this marriage from day one, just waiting for you to stop playing house and start protecting family interests. The room spun around me. You knew? This whole time you knew what was happening and you just watched? Of course we knew. Do you think we'd let our daughter marry into a family like that without insurance? The prenup fraud, the financial abuse, David's pathetic attempts to live above his means on your money. We documented everything. We were just waiting for you to grow up enough to use it. My own family. The people who had taught me that love was conditional, that relationships were transactions, that power was more important than compassion. I'd been so focused on the Martinez family's toxicity that I'd forgotten where I'd learned to think of relationships as power games in the first place. What if everything you thought you knew was wrong? What if the real problem wasn't David's family or my family, but the entire system that had taught us all that love was something you earned through performance rather than something you gave freely? The mother-in-law I destroyed, I whispered, looking at Patricia's tear-streaked face with new eyes. She wasn't a cartoon villain. She was a woman who'd been taught that her son's worth was tied to his ability to marry up, just like I'd been taught that my worth was tied to my ability to protect family assets. Have you ever hated someone, then realized they were hurting too? Patricia's cruelty hadn't come from evil. It had come from fear. Fear that her son wasn't good enough. Fear that her family wasn't worthy. Fear that admitting weakness would cost them everything. She'd been just as trapped as I was, I said out loud, and David looked up sharply. What? But I wasn't talking to him anymore. I was talking to myself, trying to understand how we'd all gotten so lost in this maze of hurt and pride and desperation. Patricia had been protecting her family the only way she knew how, by making sure I knew I didn't belong, just like my family had been protecting their interests by making sure I never forgot that relationships were business arrangements. The call from my mother had revealed the ultimate truth. I wasn't breaking free from a toxic system. I was just playing my assigned role in it, the role of the wealthy daughter who finally learned to use her power to crush anyone who dared to challenge the family hierarchy. Are we all just repeating cycles of hurt? Because suddenly I could see the pattern stretching back generations, wealth protecting wealth, power protecting power, and anyone caught in between getting crushed under the wheels of family dynasties that cared more about legacy than love. My phone was still buzzing with updates from lawyers, investigators, federal agents. The Martinez family was about to be destroyed, not because they were uniquely evil, but because they'd had the misfortune to cross someone with more power than they had. Someone who'd been trained from birth to use that power without mercy. Someone who was becoming exactly what they'd accused me of being all along. I had a choice: perpetuate the cycle or break it. The legal proceedings were still in motion, but they could be stopped. The investigation could be called off, the charges dropped, the assets unfrozen. It would cost me nothing to show mercy. Nothing except my pride and my thirst for revenge. What would you choose? Revenge or healing? Because standing in that room, surrounded by the wreckage of a family that had hurt me, and the knowledge that I was about to hurt them infinitely worse, I realized that revenge was just another word for becoming the monster that made the monster that hurt you. Real strength wasn't destroying others. It was having the power to destroy them and choosing not to. It was looking at Patricia's tears and David's fear and Robert's broken pride and deciding that their pain didn't heal mine. Real strength isn't destroying others, I said out loud, and Patricia looked up with surprise. I pulled out my phone and dialed my attorney. Marcus, it's Emily Martinez. I need you to stop the federal investigation. Yes, all of it. Drop the charges, unfreeze the accounts, withdraw the civil suit, because I'm choosing to be the person I wished they had been to me. Sometimes the bravest thing is walking away from a fight you can win, especially when winning would cost you your soul. The hardest part wasn't forgiving them. It was forgiving myself for almost becoming someone I couldn't live with. The prenup could stay. David could keep the money I'd already given him. The family could continue their charade of wealth and status. But I was done playing their game, and I was done letting my family's game play me. Do you believe in the power of forgiveness? Because 6 months later, something unexpected happened that made me understand why mercy is always stronger than revenge. I was having coffee with a friend when I saw Patricia at a corner table, alone, reading a book about toxic family dynamics. She looked smaller somehow, more human, less like the intimidating matriarch who terrorized me for a decade. When our eyes met, she didn't look away. She walked over to my table slowly, like she was approaching a wild animal that might bolt. "Emily," she said quietly, Could I sit down for a moment?" The family meeting I called this time was different, not in Robert's study with its power dynamics and intimidation tactics, but in a neutral coffee shop where we could meet as equals. Patricia came alone without her armor of designer clothes and family authority. What do you think changed in how I approached them? Everything. Instead of fighting for my place in their family, I'd chosen to build my own life based on authentic connections. "I've been going to therapy," Patricia said without preamble, "trying to understand why I treated you the way I did, why I was so afraid of you from the beginning." I stirred my coffee, waiting. This wasn't about accepting her apology or granting her absolution. This was about two women trying to understand how they'd gotten trapped in roles that hurt them both. "I was terrified," she continued. "Terrified that David wasn't good enough for someone like you. Terrified that you'd see through our facade and leave him. Terrified that if I showed you any kindness, you'd have even more power over our family than you already did just by existing." She paused, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "So I decided to hurt you first, to make you small enough that you couldn't hurt us. And the cruel irony is that you never wanted to hurt us at all. You just wanted us to love you." Healing isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing differently. And in that moment, I chose to see Patricia not as the villain of my story, but as another woman who'd been trapped by fear and expectations and the impossible weight of trying to protect her family in a world that felt dangerous and unpredictable. My ex-mother-in-law said something that shocked me. I told my friend later, recounting the conversation. I realized I could either teach my sons to fear women or teach them to respect them. And I chose wrong with David, but I'm hoping it's not too late to choose differently with my grandsons. That's when I understood that my choice to show mercy hadn't just saved the Martinez family from destruction. It had created space for actual healing to begin, not just for me, but for all of us. The divorce was finalized quietly, without drama or vindictiveness. David and I met one last time to sign papers, and he looked like a different person, smaller, sadder, but somehow more real than he'd been in years. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time, it sounded like he meant it. "I'm sorry for all of it. For lying, for taking your money, for letting my family treat you like that, for not being brave enough to love you the way you deserved." I realized I could either be a victim or break the chain for future generations. My choice to step away from revenge had created ripples I couldn't have anticipated. Patricia was in therapy, working on her relationships with her other children. Robert had started attending Al-Anon meetings, addressing the drinking problem that had contributed to his business failures. David was learning to live within his means and build genuine relationships. Most importantly, Patricia's grandchildren would grow up in a family that was learning to value emotional honesty over financial performance. The cycle of using money as a weapon, of measuring love in dollars and status symbols, of teaching children that their worth was tied to their ability to marry strategically. That cycle was finally broken. What cycle in your life are you ready to break? Because as I sat in my new apartment, smaller than the Martinez family home, but filled with furniture I'd chosen because I loved it rather than because it impressed anyone, I realized that the real victory wasn't destroying them. The real victory was discovering that I could build a life based on love instead of fear, on authenticity instead of performance, on connection instead of control. The real victory was learning that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away from power itself. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of story that's worth telling. Not a story about revenge or justice or getting even, but a story about what happens when someone chooses to be bigger than the worst thing that was done to them. The prenup they'd made me sign was still in my jewelry box, but it had become something different. Not a symbol of my humiliation, but a reminder of how far I'd traveled from the person who'd been afraid to stand up for herself to the person who was strong enough to choose mercy over vengeance. Sometimes the best revenge is living well, but sometimes the best revenge is choosing not to seek revenge at all.